Hello, scholars. This is Mr. Myers doing lesson 2.9 on checks and balances. Make sure you take good structured notes over our objectives. We're going to be talking about the difference between checks and balances and separation of powers, two concepts that kids often get confused. And then we're going to be looking at specific legislative checks over the other two branches, and then the same for the executive checks and judicial checks. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between separation of powers and checks and balances. First of all, understand that under our system we have separated out different powers and given them to different branches of government. In our case, we have three different branches of government: the executive branch, which enforces laws; the legislative branch, which makes laws; and the judicial branch, which judges laws. This concept of separating out different branches of government was developed by Baron de Montesquieu in influential French work, The Spirit of the Laws, in 1748. Now, once you have separated out the different branches of government, then what you do is you give some powers to one branch over the other branches. Each branch or part has power over the others to check or stop them from becoming too strong. So the first thing you do is you separate the branches of government, and then you give each powers over the others. So on test day, you're going to have to explain the difference between separation of powers and checks and balances, and then you're going to have to explain certain checks that the legislative has over the executive and the judicial, and so on and so forth. So let's start by the legislative checks on the other two branches of government. In terms of the legislative checks on the executive, the legislative branch can override a presidential veto with 2/3 vote of both houses. The legislative branch can impeach and remove the president if the president has committed wrongdoing. The legislative branch can refuse to confirm nominees or treaties negotiated by the president, and also appropriate funds or not appropriate funds, depending on the situation. So those are four different checks the legislative has on the executive. The legislative checks the judiciary by creating the lower courts. That was one of the powers that were articulated in Article 1, Section 8 for the legislative branch. The legislative branch can change the size of the Supreme Court. There's nothing that says that we have to have 9 justices. We've had different numbers of justices on the Supreme Court over time. Another check on the judiciary is the ability for the Congress to impeach and remove judges, to refuse to confirm nominees as federal judges. And if the Supreme Court overturns an act of Congress, of course, Congress can propose a constitutional amendment which would usurp or go above that Supreme Court power. Okay, so the executive can check the legislative branch by vetoing acts of Congress, by recommending legislation. This one's kind of an informal one. The president can use his office as a bully pulpit. And what this basically refers to is that the president has an outsized voice, can use their office and their ability to get the media involved to outline policy positions or initiatives that the president likes, or to articulate things the president doesn't like that Congress might be doing, and therefore can shape public opinion in a way that might force the legislature to do what the president wants it to do. In addition, the executive branch can refuse to enforce federal law. That's a little bit, possibly unconstitutional, but technically a check that the executive would have in the legislature. In terms of the judiciary, the executive branch nominates and appoints federal judges, can grant pardons to federal offenders, not state crimes, but those committing federal crimes, and then refuse to enforce federal court decisions. Again, somewhat possibly unconstitutionally, but again, a power that it has over the judiciary. The last one is the easiest one. The judicial branch checks the legislature by ruling laws unconstitutional and checks the executive by ruling executive actions unconstitutional. So hopefully now you can articulate the difference between checks and balances and separation of powers and be able to describe the checks that each branch has over the other two. As always, please bring any questions to class.